Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to Fear Flicks Factory. This story happened a few years back when I was living with my ex-boyfriend. We had moved into a 2-bedroom house and were busy making it our cozy place. We transformed one of the bedrooms into an office because the only bathroom was accessible through it. We often had friends crash on our sofa, and we didn't want them to go through our bedroom to use the bathroom. About a month after we moved in, my ex was out with his coworkers, so I was home alone. I spent the early evening watching TV and eating some takeout. A few times, I heard some strange noises, but every time I tried to figure out what it was, the noise stopped. It got later, so I decided to go upstairs and use the computer for a bit before going to bed. At that time, we didn't have our phone lines set up, so I was using a pay-as-you-go phone with no more credit left. That means I couldn't talk to anyone while I was in the house. I sat in the back room with only a small table lamp that gave off a weak light. As I was typing on the laptop, I heard those strange noises again. It started as a quiet, rattling sound, very faint, so I had to listen to make sure it wasn't just my imagination. I turned off the music and tried to figure out what was making the noise. I went into our bedroom and looked down at the front door. No one there. I returned to the back bedroom, but it was hard to see much out of that window. Our yard was small, surrounded by a tall brick wall, and there was no light near the wooden gate. From what I could see, there was nothing in the backyard either. So, I sat back down and turned the music back on. About 10 minutes later, I heard a screeching noise, like metal rubbing against metal. Once again, it was very faint, like whatever was causing it was trying hard to be quiet. I was starting to feel pretty scared at this point, so I left our bedroom to get a heavy iron rod that we had found in the back of the closet. I didn't turn on any lights because I didn't know what was happening, and I didn't want to let anyone who might be in the house know where I was. Remember, I couldn't call anyone, and I was getting pretty worried that there might be someone in my house. I went back into the office bedroom, closed the door as quietly as I could, then locked it and placed a chair under the handle. For about 20 minutes, nothing else happened. I began to feel a bit silly for getting so worked up. I thought it might be because it was my first night alone in the house. But this time, I didn't turn the music back on, and it was a good thing because a few minutes later, I started hearing sounds like 2 people whispering, and both voices were male. Luckily, the voices didn't seem like they were inside the house. So, I had the office window open just a bit, and the sound seemed to be coming from there. I went into the bathroom to get a better look at the alley behind the house. The office bedroom and the bathroom formed an L shape around a yard, and the bathroom extended further out. I climbed up on the ledge and slowly opened the window to see into the alley. I couldn't see anything, but now the whispering was much louder, right behind the gate. I couldn't hear the whole conversation, but I heard enough to understand these guys had noticed when we moved in and saw that we had a lot of valuable stuff like guitars, computers, my DSLR camera, TV gaming consoles, and more. I thought they must have noticed that I was home alone and were waiting for me to go to sleep before trying to get into the house. I stayed on that ledge for what felt like a very long time until I heard a really loud thud. They seemed to have given up on being quiet and were now trying to force their way through the gate. I saw it shaking from their strong pushes, and I could only guess how big these guys were. I'm a small girl, about 5'3" tall, and I weighed around 98 lb at that time, so I was really scared watching the gate struggling to hold up. I held on to the iron rod, thinking about where I could hide from them. Then, all of a sudden, a bright light came from behind me. At first, I freaked out and hid, thinking they were using a flashlight at the back of the house. But then I heard dogs barking and people shouting. I took another look, and when I saw the house across the alley had a strong light which lit up their yard, I heard some grumbling and swearing, and then 2 sets of footsteps hurried away down the alley. I stayed in the bathroom, locked in until my ex-boyfriend came home drunk at 4:00 a.m. I couldn't sleep at all that night. When I went out into the yard the next morning, my gate barely hung on, making it easy for anyone to come in from the alley. When I checked the back of the gate, I saw the keyhole was all scratched up, like someone tried to break the lock. If they hadn't alerted the house behind us, I'm scared to think about what might have happened. I'm a 23-year-old female and started working as a babysitter to earn some extra money to help my parents pay for my college. At that time, we didn't have a lot of money and didn't want to rely on student loans. At first, I only babysat for my neighbors, but people liked how I took care of their kids, and more parents asked me to babysit for them. They especially needed me on the weekends when they had plans or special events. Most of the kids I babysat were easy to look after, so I began to enjoy the job. This experience got me thinking about changing my college major to something that involves working with kids. So, I thought about studying childcare or something like that. I enjoyed babysitting, and I had a strong feeling to protect the kids I looked after. One Friday night, instead of hanging out with my friends, I went to babysit for one of the families I regularly help. I drove my old Jetta to their big house in the fancy neighborhood. I liked this family because they had a nice home and also paid me well. When I got there, the parents were already at the door. We quickly said our goodbyes, and then they hurried off to some fancy event on Friday night. They had 2 kids, both boys. The older child was 5 years old, and the little one was just a year old. They were already sleeping when I arrived, so I didn't have much to do except wait for the parents to come back. I thought about watching a movie, but I was worried it might wake up the kids, and it was pretty late. Then I remembered the lady of the house had a nice collection of romance novels, some of which were a bit too grown-up for me. I'm pretty sure she knew I read her books, but she didn't seem to mind. I was sitting in the kids' room. The lights were off, but there was a nightlight that gave me enough light to read and keep an eye on them. I moved the sofa closer to the window to see the street outside. Then I got all settled in. It looked like I'd be up late. The book I was reading was really interesting and kept me engaged for a while. But at some point during the night, I noticed something moving outside the window. I thought it might be the parents coming home, but it wasn't them. Instead, I saw 2 guys in dark clothes. One had a mask covering his whole face, and the other just covered the bottom part of his face. I got really scared and couldn't move. I watched in fear as these 2 guys quietly came up to the house, but then I quickly snapped out of it and grabbed my phone. I got really confused and decided to call the lady first. Her phone rang, but she didn't answer. I didn't try calling the man, as there wasn't much time left. Those guys were already at the house. I couldn't see them, but I knew they were looking for a way inside. Luckily, I had locked all the doors and checked them again before going upstairs. Then I dialed 911. A lady answered and asked me what was wrong. I explained the situation. Her voice changed from sounding a little bored to sounding very serious. She asked for the address and then told me the police were on their way. But there was a short pause, and then she said, "Gather everyone in the house you're looking after and try to lock yourselves in a bathroom or hide under a bed." At that moment, I realized that the police wouldn't arrive quickly enough. I needed to escape, but I couldn't just leave the 2 sleeping kids behind. I started to panic, trying to figure out what to do. Where could I hide? Should I leave the house altogether? This job wasn't worth all this trouble. I was scared thinking about whether I might get hurt or taken by those guys. Suddenly, while I was worrying about a million things, I heard the sound of breaking glass downstairs. Now I knew I was out of time. I grabbed a chair and pushed it against the door to make it harder for them to get in. Then I rushed to get the baby carrier from the closet in the room. I quickly put the baby in the carrier and strapped it on. The baby got a little restless, but fortunately fell back asleep. The older brother woke up when I touched him. He was about to say something, but I covered his mouth with my hand before he could make a sound. Then I heard footsteps coming up the stairs. These guys were attempting to stay quiet, but it was difficult for them. They probably thought everyone in the house was asleep. They were big, and trying to be quiet didn't work very well. I didn't think the door and the chair would hold them back for long. The older boy stayed quiet, even when I took my hand away from his mouth. He looked very scared, and I understood why. I was scared too. I took his arm and tried to guide him away from his bed, but he stopped, and his face showed he was unhappy.
He started to pull away from me, trying to get my hand off his arm.
I got really worried. I didn't want this to happen. He wasn't the kind of kid who just did what he was told. He questioned everything because his parents taught him to be that way. So, I bent down and whispered in his ear as quietly as I could, "We have to be quiet inside this house. Please listen to me and do what I say." After a moment, he agreed, probably because of how serious I sounded. I felt relieved that he would follow my instructions, but it didn't last long. I heard someone trying to open the door we were in. They pushed it but couldn't get it to open. I looked at the older boy, and he looked really scared. I motioned for him to stay calm and gently rubbed his shoulder. My hands were shaking. I heard the door open. The main bedroom wasn't locked, so I hoped they would spend some time in there. They were opening a different door, not the one we were in, so I took the boy to the window, hoping we had more time because they were now in our bedroom. I quietly opened the window and climbed onto the roof. It took a bit of convincing, but eventually, I got the other boy to come with me. By the time we were on the roof, the men were back at the door, and they were making more noise this time. That made the older boy decide to join us on the roof, so we were all outside the house, but I didn't know where to go from there. I had a baby in one hand and a young boy in the other. Finding a safe way to get down with both of them wasn't easy. If I were by myself, I might have taken a risk, but I couldn't leave without the two kids. We were stuck on the roof with nowhere to go. The men broke their way in, so I grabbed the older boy, and we huddled in the corner of the roof. The baby was still sleeping, but the boy was scared and held onto me tightly. I silently cried, hoping and praying that someone would come to help us. Suddenly, one of the men opened the window and looked out. I was terrified, and it showed on my face. Our eyes met, and he looked at me, and then at the kids I was holding. I thought he might say something. There was a moment when we just looked at each other. Then he suddenly turned away and urgently called out to his partner, "Oh no!" I think they saw us coming. "They've escaped, which means they might have called the police by now," he said. The other guy asked, "What? How?" but didn't get an answer. I don't know for sure, but it seemed like the other guy didn't want his friend to find us, as if he knew his friend might do something bad to us. Then I heard them rushing downstairs, and their heavy footsteps echoed throughout the whole house. It means they were coming outside, so I thought about going back inside to make sure the other one didn't see us there, but I was too scared to move. I watched as both men ran out of the back of the house and started heading down the driveway. Then I heard sirens in the distance. The men heard it too and started running faster. They jumped over the fence just before I saw red and blue lights approaching. The police found us on the roof. I was still shaking when they brought us back inside. We finally reached the kids' parents, and they returned to the house in less than half an hour. My parents arrived shortly after. I never really got over the fear from that night, but I also felt thankful to the man for not hurting us. It might sound strange, but I was a little relieved that they didn't catch us, especially his friend. My grandma raised me for a big part of my life, and I'm thankful for that. She taught me many important values and how to be a respectful person. But there was one story she told me that still sends shivers down my spine. It happened to her when she was just a teenager living in a small, tight-knit community. Back in those days, life was simpler, and people often left their doors unlocked, trusting their neighbors and feeling safe. One evening, my grandma's parents were away, leaving her alone in the house. It was a peaceful night, and she was reading a book in the living room, enjoying the quiet. The only source of light came from a dim lamp, casting shadows that danced on the walls. Suddenly, she heard a soft knock at the front door. Puzzled, she got up to see who it was. Through the frosted glass of the front door, she could make out the silhouette of a man. He seemed disheveled, and his appearance raised immediate concerns. She cautiously approached the door, asking, "Who is it?" The man on the other side spoke with a shaky voice, claiming he needed help. He said his car had broken down, and he needed to use the phone to call for assistance. Despite her gut feeling telling her something was off, my grandma was a kind-hearted person and wanted to help. However, she remembered her parents' warnings about opening the door to strangers, especially when she was alone. Instead of unlocking the door, she offered to make the call for him. She explained that he could provide her with the number, and she would dial it for him. The man became more insistent, pleading with her to open the door, emphasizing that it was urgent. Sensing danger, my grandma stood her ground and refused. At that moment, the man's demeanor changed. His pleas turned into aggressive demands, and he began rattling the doorknob forcefully, trying to force his way in. Terrified, my grandma rushed to the kitchen, grabbing a heavy skillet. She hid behind the living room door, ready to defend herself if the intruder managed to break in. The man persisted, slamming his body against the door. It seemed like an eternity, but eventually he gave up and disappeared into the darkness. Shaken and scared, my grandma waited until she was sure he was gone before checking through the window. She saw him walking away, disappearing into the night. The next morning, she learned from her neighbors that a similar incident had occurred in the area. A man matching the description had attempted to enter several houses, and the police were now involved. From that day forward, my grandma became even more cautious, always locking doors and windows, even in their seemingly safe community. The incident left a lasting impact on her, instilling a sense of vigilance and reinforcing the importance of trusting one's instincts. As she shared this story with me, my grandma emphasized the importance of staying alert, especially when alone. It's a lesson that has stuck with me throughout my life, a reminder that safety should never be taken for granted, even in the most seemingly secure environments.